In 2016, during the Clinton-Trump campaign, the Democrats could not acknowledge what a terrible candidate Hillary Clinton was. And when she lost, they first blamed James Comey's public statements about the investigation into her emails and server and said it was election interference. And then they said it was the Russians. The Russians stole the election. To this day, despite the Mueller investigation proving it not being so, to this day, there are Democrats who are convinced the Russians stole the 2016 election. They're convinced. They can't acknowledge that they lost. In fact, Democrats have never been willing to acknowledge they've lost since Bush versus Gore. They can't acknowledge they lost it. It's always someone is to blame. It's never them. Fast forward to 2020, and Hunter Biden's laptop became a story. 51 supposed national security experts, including the current Secretary of State, and a number of people who are now talking heads on television, they released a letter and said, like in 2016, the Russians stealing that election, this was Russian disinformation. It is simply not true. Yesterday in Hunter Biden's trial, the FBI confirmed under oath in a courtroom, FBI agent confirmed the Hunter Biden laptop is real. Now, we've known this for some time, and in fact, more and more media outlets have begun to acknowledge the truth that the Hunter Biden laptop was real all along. The emails were real. The emails and texts about payments to the big guy were real. Everything was real. Now, separate story. After 2020, one of the very first people to suggest that the COVID virus came from a lab, Senator Tom Cotton. Now, Democrats and the left first were the ones to use the China virus, the Wuhan virus, the China virus. But when Donald Trump started saying it, suddenly it became racist to say the China virus. Even though the members of the media had been referring to it as the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the virus from China, the virus from Wuhan, that suddenly became racist to say. And when Tom Cotton suggested that the COVID virus came from a lab in China, the media went nuts, accusing him of racism. Tom Cotton's point was that it's absurd to think that this virus jumped from an animal to a human at a Chinese wet market when there was a lab in Wuhan studying these viruses and studying gain of function on these viruses. And the first that we know of illnesses came from people who were at that lab. What do you think is more likely, that it came from the lab or came from a wet market? And by the way, isn't it racist to say, no, actually, it's the Chinese diet that caused the virus as opposed to a lab that studies these viruses? But the media went with it was more racist to think it came from a Chinese lab than to think it came from Chinese eating disgusting food at a wet market. Apurva Mandavili is the New York Times germ immunology and healthcare writer. And Apurva Mandavili on social media tweeted this. She tweeted this on Twitter. Someday we will stop talking about the lab leak theory and maybe even admit its racist roots. But alas, that day is not yet here. Apurva Mandavili is the healthcare writer for global health and infectious diseases at the New York Times, still on the payroll. And it is now the New York Times that has done a very deep dive into the origins of COVID and concluded, yeah, actually, it probably came from a lab. The FBI is correct. The Department of Energy, which studies these sorts of things, is correct. It probably did come from a lab. Why? Because the lab in Wuhan studied these sorts of viruses, and the very first people that we know of who got sick from the virus worked at that lab. It's probably the fact that it came from that lab. And so the New York Times reporter for healthcare says that's racist, and yet she works for the New York Times that says it probably did. These are two separate stories, but they all relate to the same thing. Glenn Kessler is the fact checker at the Washington Post. Ted Cruz, back in May 1st, 2020, tweeted, "Amazing is definitely the right word for this video. The Washington Post abandoning all pretense of journalism to produce CCP propaganda," that would be Chinese Communist Party propaganda, would be another way to put it. If this reporter submitted this video in a freshman logic class, it wouldn't receive a passing grade. This was Ted Cruz responding to a Washington Post animation that the Washington Post produced based on Chinese Communist Party talking points to show that it'd be virtually impossible for the coronavirus to come from that lab. Glenn Kessler, the fact checker for the Washington Post, responded to Ted Cruz with this, quote, "I fear Ted Cruz missed the scientific animation in the video that shows how it is virtually impossible for this virus jump from the lab or the many interviews with actual scientists. We deal in facts and viewers can judge for themselves." Apparently, the animation was scientific. Now, the New York Times concludes the virus most likely did come from a lab, and notably, the person who wrote this in the New York Times was one of the foremost skeptics of the lab leak theory. Glenn Kessler, a fact checker at the Washington Post, attacked Ted Cruz for pointing out that actually the lab leak theory was the most obvious source. The New York Times healthcare reporter attacked people as racist for suggesting the lab leak theory was the most obvious thing. It turns out the lab leak theory holds up. The Department of Energy has biohazard labs. The Department of Energy specializes in tracing biohazards. The Department of Energy has concluded the lab leak theory is the most credible one. The FBI has concluded it. The CIA says it doesn't have a position, but it leans towards the lab leak theory. Now, the New York Times, a skeptic of the lab leak theory, posts a comprehensive op-ed where a lot of people are saying, you know what, this actually makes a lot of sense. It probably came from the lab. Yes. And everyone who said that was labeled racist. 51 supposed experts said that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. This is from the New York Post. For the first time Tuesday, first son Hunter Biden's notorious laptop from hell, whose scandalous contents were first reported by the New York Post 4 years ago, was shown to a jury of his peers, with federal prosecutors making it a key part of their case, accusing the president's child of illegally owning a gun while addicted to drugs. The pivotal moment unfolded after prosecutor Derek Hines brought out a plastic-wrapped laptop, walked it across the courtroom, and presented it to his first witness, FBI agent Erick Jensen. Jensen took the MacBook Pro 13 and verified, after looking at the serial number, that it had in fact belonged to Hunter Biden. Prosecutors from the Office of Special Counsel David Weiss must prove to jurors that Hunter, 54, intentionally lied on a gun application form by claiming he didn't do drugs when he purchased a Colt Cobra revolver. The feds were quick to begin using information extracted from the laptop to lay out a timeline of when they say Hunter was using before and after he bought the firearm. 51 experts told us that the laptop was Russian disinformation. And when it turned out it wasn't, they said, well, maybe some of the contents of the laptop were disinformation. They were wrong on all of that. Some of these people are still on CNN. Some of these people are still on MSNBC. Some of these people are still regularly quoted in the media. Where do we go for our apology? The laptop had nothing to do with Russian information. The lab leak theory was not racist. And everyone in the media insisted the one was disinformation and the other was racist. Where do the American people go to the press to get their apology? Do you wonder why people don't trust the American press corps? This is actually for you guys in the press. Do you understand why people do not trust you? You lied about the Hunter Biden laptop. You ran the story that it was Russian disinformation. You people ganged up on one of your peers, the New York Post, and encouraged Twitter to censor the New York Post for telling the truth. You people, you reporters did that, not us. Not the people you say are a threat to democracy. You people who are a threat to democracy, you're the ones in the media who did that. You people are the ones who told us the laptop was Russian disinformation, and you people are the ones who told us it was racist to say the Wuhan virus came from a lab. We were racist for doing it. We were pawns of the Russians. You lied. You lied the whole time. You vilified Americans who didn't agree with the left-wing agenda. You vilified Americans, and you're doing it again now. You're calling Donald Trump a threat to democracy without a hint of irony towards Democrats who try to unilaterally take him off ballots. rejected unanimously by a Supreme Court that you people in the press continue to undermine because they're not giving the left their way. You people in the press have refused to cover Judge Merchant's political donations and raise questions about its conflict of interest. You're willing to raise questions about Judge Eileen Cannon's conflict of interest because she was appointed by Donald Trump. You're not willing to do it to Judge Merchant, who gave specifically money earmarked to a fund to stop Trump and his right-wing agenda. You people in the press have destroyed your own credibility. You worry about disinformation. You worry about misinformation. You wring your hands over what AI could do and the threats. You people are the biggest liars out there. Y'all are the ones peddling disinformation and misinformation, but the problem is you're doing it for an agenda. You're doing it for the specific agenda of helping the left. Your credibility is shot through. Your ratings are down. People aren't buying your newspapers, and you're blaming other people instead of yourselves. You lack humility. You lack honesty. You lack the self-awareness to acknowledge you've made mistakes, and you lack the ability to say you're sorry for lying to the American people. Instead, you want to lie about others. And then the people who lied to the American public about the laptop, the people who lied to the American public about the virus, you platform them. You give them contributor deals. You put them on to continue their lying to us, and then you wonder why we don't believe you. That's why. You people are a bunch of hacks and liars. You can't be honest about the Hunter Biden laptop. You've failed to be honest about the lab leak theory. You've promoted the people who called others racist because of the lab leak theory. You promoted people who called Russian disinformation the Hunter Biden laptop. This is why people don't trust you. The American people need a free and honest press. And what we have is a press captive to their hatreds of the right and therefore willing to say or do anything to stop their political opponents. That's not a free press. That is a press enslaved to their fears and hatred of others.